Baruch Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Zevachim Daf Kuf Tes Vav 115. As we come almost to the conclusion of tract Zevachim, the first half of our daf is classic Zevachim. It's the intricate discussions of the technical details of a carbon, and the second half of our daf is it's very, very important. Very, very important. Some of the Agadata that I find myself remembering the most from the Gemara. So we'll start here on the bottom of Kuf Yudalad on the base 114b. That the Mishnah had said that there were certain korbanos that if you brought them before there was the proper time for you to bring them, you have to bring them at a certain time. If you brought them before then you're not going to be liable. If you brought them outside the base of Mikdash, you're not going to be liable for shlitas chutz because the carbon was brought before the proper time, and so therefore was not right to come to the Ol Moed. In that context, Rabbi Chilkiah Bar Rav Tuvi said, Lo Shanu, when do we say that if you brought the asham of the Mitzorah, the carbon that the Mitzorah has to bring when he completes his period, that if he brings that asham outside too early, he's exempt from kares? That's only the case if he brought the asham with shmo, if he brought it for the purpose of an asham. Remember when we learned on the first day of Masechas Zevachim that every carbon that you bring shelo shmo is good, except it has not fulfilled the obligation of the owner. Well, if that's the case, so when do we say that the asham you're not liable for kares if you brought a shlutei chutz, if you brought it for the proper purpose of al shelo shmo? But if you brought it not for the purpose of an asham, but brought it for an olah, then actually it would be a valid carbon inside. So then it is ro'el of all pesach moed, and so therefore, according to Rav Chilkiah Bar Tuvi, you would be liable for kares. So if you brought it with shmo, you're exempt. But if you brought a shelo shmo, you're liable. Because if you brought shelo inside, you would in fact be a valid offering. Where it says, well, if that's your logic, we should also obligate you if you brought a lishmo outside. Because since if you brought a shelo inside, then you would be liable. So therefore, this animal is royal of all Pesach or Moed. Mor says, no, it doesn't work like that. By Akira, you would have to first uproot it from being an asham in order to say if you brought it lishmo, that you would be liable. So therefore, that's Rav Chilkiah Bar Tuvi's rule. His rule is that if you brought this asham lishmo, you're exempt if it's too early. But if you brought shelo lishmo, you're actually going to be liable. So Rav Huna challenges Rav Chilkiah, and that's the first half of our daf. Rav Huna challenges to Rav Chilkiah. Wait 1 second. You're telling me that this animal, if you bring it lishmo, is not kosher, but if you bring it shelo lishmo, it is kosher? Do you ever have such an example of that? That flies in the face of logic. The Gemara says, really? V'lo v'harei Pesach. What about the carbon Pesach? Carbon Pesach on top of Kuftes Vavam and Alf, B'Sharimos Hashanah, that the rest of the year, the Eino kosher lishmo, that if you bring it for the purpose of a Pesach, it's not kosher. The kosher shelo lishmo, but if you bring in shelo lishmo the rest of the year, it will be a kosher shlamim. Gemara says, no, don't give me a proof from the Pesach, because Pesach B'Sharimos Hashanah shlamim ninu. The Pesach, by definition, the rest of the year, you don't have to. It's not considered shelo lishmo. It becomes a shlamim. And so therefore, that's not a good proof. So the Gemara says, okay, we have a dispute here between Rav Chilkiah Bar Tuvi and Rav Huna. Rav Chilkiah says that if you bring this asham shelo lishmo before the time of the asham, then you're actually going to be liable for kares. And Rav Huna says you're not, because we never have such a case of that lo lishmo is kosher and lishmo is not kosher. So lema messiah. So the Gemara says, let's bring a proof for Rav Chilkiah from the following brisa. Yeah, and this price is actually going to be cited twice on the daf. Yachol she'anem motzi from this pasuk from Pesach al Moed lo Hiviu, that all these animals you're liable for shlutei chutz. I might think that I should exclude also an olas mechusar zman bebalim. If an ola was brought before the owners came to the proper time, and say they were not yet able to bring a carbon, I might think that that's also excluded. Va'asham nazir, va'asham mitzora. I might think I'll exclude the asham nazir and also the asham mitzora from this liability. Tamlomer sure mikomakom kesef mikomakom a's mikomakom. So I might have thought. I would have thought that you will not be liable in all these cases. So we're saying, according to the Brisa, that you are liable if you brought the Ola before the proper time of the owner and the Asham and the Nazir, of the Asham of the Nazir and the Asham of the Mitzorah. And we learn out from the words in the verse, Shor Kesef Eis. V'iu Chatos Shayara, but it doesn't mention the Chatos. So now, what's the example that we're talking about where you're not liable in all these cases? The Maya Skina, what are we talking about? Ilema Bismano, if we're talking about that you brought the carbon in the proper time, well, why would we say if it's in the proper time and we're going to say you're not, that you are liable? My area Asham, why does it say you're liable for the Asham? Why only the Asham? I feel Chatas Nami. Also, the Chatas also you should be liable if it's brought in the proper time. So Ella Shalo is mana. So what must be talking about a case, it was before the proper time. Ubamai. And what are we referring to? We're Ilay Moishmo, if we're talking about where you brought it before the proper time for the right purpose. Asham and Maichayev, why are you liable for the Asham? So Elav, so it must be talking about Shalo Ishmo. You brought it for the wrong purpose, and it was before the proper time, and we're saying you're not liable. So this therefore Elav Shalo Ishmo. And so what we must be saying that we're talking about here is this case where it was brought before the proper time with the wrong intent. And the Brisa does not mention the Chatas. And from the fact that the Brisa does not mention the Chatas, it proves that only the Asham that was slaughtered before the proper time, Shalo Ishmo, is liable, because therefore the Asham is able to be brought inside, and that's like Rav Chilkiah. But the chatos that was slaughtered outside, it'll be exempt because the chatos cannot be brought inside. So that's the Gemara's point from the fact that it draws this distinction between the asham and the chatos. So the Gemara says, no, really the Bryce is talking about a case. We're talking about a case. Why are you liable? It was brought in the proper time, even Shalolish and Shalolishmo. It was brought in the proper time. And it was Shalol Shmo, the Rebbe Eliezer. He and followed the position of Rebbe Eliezer, the Amar Makshinim Asham Lachatas. That just we remember we said this also back in the very beginning of our tractate. Rebbe Eliezer compares the Asham to the Chatas. That just like the Chatas that was slaughtered inside Shalol Shma is disqualified, also an Asham that was slaughtered inside Shalol Shma is disqualified. And the Bryce is teaching us that if you slaughtered it outside Shalol Shma, you're going to be liable. And the reason is because since if you slaughtered inside, it will be kosher. So too, if you slaughtered it outside. And also the chatas, you'll be liable because if you slaughtered it inside, it will be kosher. Vitana tafel, and it taught the secondary law, i.e. the law of the asham, v'hu adin lachatas. And it's the same thing, v'hu adin l'ikar. It's the same thing, obviously, for the chatas. So it's not a proof for Chilkiah Bar Tuvi. Gemara attempts a second attempt to prove Reb Chilkiah Bar Tuvi's point from a similar brisa. Yachol shani marba olas mechusers man begufa b'chatos bein begufa bein bebaum. I might think, says the brisa, that I will include in the verse an ola that is missing, that is before the proper time in the animal itself. Let's say you brought it before it was 8 days old, ubein bebaum, and also a chatos. Chatos bein begufa bein begaum. A chatos, whether it was the animal wasn't old enough yet, or the nazir or the mitzorah were not yet ready to bring it. I might think that you're liable if you slaughter them outside the Beis Hamikdash, outside the Azara. Tamom or Pesach or Moed. Kol she'ino ra'oi lavo Pesach or Moed. In Chayiv and Oeh. Anything that's not capable to be brought to the Ol Moed, you're not liable. So you're not liable for a Olam Mechusar Zman and a Chatas. But you asham shayara, but it doesn't mention the asham. So what are we talking about? What's this case referring to? B'maya skinan. What's this case referring to? If we're talking about a case where it was slaughtered for the right purpose, Asham Nami Liftere, the Asham would also should be exempt if it was slaughtered Lishmo before the proper time. It must be like Rav Chalki Bar Tuvi taught. Elav Shelo Lishmo. Talking about a case where you slaughtered it with the wrong intent before the proper time, and that's why you're exempt. A perfect proof for Rav Chalki. So the Gemara says no. Olam Shelo Lishmo. We're talking about a case where you slaughtered it for the wrong intent, and you're liable. The asham is not excluded. Rabbi Eliezer he demakish asham lechatas, that it compares the asham to the chatas. So it's Rabbi Eliezer's position. And Tana Ikar v'kol shkein tafot only taught the case of the Ikar of the chatas that you're liable, and on for sure it's including the asham. The third attempt. Now the Gemara is basically going to cite another version of the discussion of the first brisa. Tashma the Chiasi Rav Dimi. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, we know when Rav Dimi comes, usually Ravin follows, but here it's not Ravin, it's Ravina, so maybe it really is Ravin, but anyway. So when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Amar Tana Debei Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi taught, Yachol Shani Motze Af Olat Mechusar Zman Bebalim, and Asham Nazir Asham Mitzora. I might think that I'll exclude from liability also an Ola whose owner was not yet capable to bring it, and an Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora, I might think that I will exclude them from the verse and say that they're exempt. And so Rav Dimi didn't bring the rest of the brisa because first he wanted to know what's going on. Matamuda, why would we think that we should not exclude them from liability? Amaravina, we would have thought that we should exclude them because it says shor mikomakom kesem mikomakom ad mikomakom. I might think that we should not exclude them. I might think that we should exclude them because of the fact that it says shor any event kesem any event in a mikomakom. So my rumia, what was the difficulty? What's the proof from this brisa? Can't you just push it off just like we said? My rumia, kida amras. Why don't we just answer like we just said that it's referring to the asham and the chata? So Amar Rav Nachman mishum derami the tanan the bei Rabbi Levi had the taning Levi. He had a different brisa that was. He was throwing the two sources against each other. What was the other brisa? The other brisa says an Asham Nazir and an Asham Mitzora Sheshachtan Shalolishman. You have an Asham Nazir and an Asham Mitzora that you slaughtered with the wrong intent. Ksherin, that they will be valid korbanos. But the owner has not fulfilled their obligation. Shachtan Mechusar Zman Bebalim. Let's say you slaughtered it before the owner was the time frame. Oshayu B'nei Shtei Shanim, or the animal itself was too young. Meshachtan and you slaughter them, it's disqualified. Umeshani Rav Dimi, and so therefore, so according to the second brisa of to slaughter them b'chutz before the proper time, they'd be exempt because they're not going to be acceptable inside. Umeshani Rav Dimi lo kasha, and Rav Dimi said it's not a contradiction. Kan lashmo and kan shelo lashmo, and we see from here that anyway we see from here that the bride of Rabbi Levi, which said that if you slaughter inside before the proper time is kosher, that's talking about a case where it was slaughtered shelo lashmo, and so therefore if you slaughtered outside, you'd be liable. And if Rav Dimi is challenging the contradiction between the two brises, it's proof that he accepted from his teachers that also the brise of Rabbi Levi is dealing with the case of the shlita before the proper time. And so therefore, it's again a proof for Rav Chilkiah that if you slaughtered it l'shmo bifnim before the proper time, it's disqualified, and outside you're exempt. And shelo l'shmo will be kosher, and b'chutz you'll be liable. So this is the proof. So Ravashi Rami Masnisin Abrai, so Mishani Khan. Ravashi also had this contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa, and he answered, "What's the distinction? Kan lishmo v'kan shelo lishmo." So lema ta'av tiyufta to Ravuna. So isn't this in fact a tiyufta of Ravuna? Amrocha Ravuna. Ravuna would say no. What's the case in the Brisa of Rabbi Levi? The case of the Brisa of Rabbi Levi is where you're liable before the proper time, just like we were speaking about. But the case, what's that talking about? Kigon Shehifrish, it wasn't talking about a case where it was slaughtered Shalol Ishmael, but it was talking about a case where you, from the outset, separated two animals. You separated two animals, and in such a case, for an asham, and in some case, the second animal, if you brought it stam, would be an ola, and therefore you'd be liable. The chaminayim neikara ola. One of them from the outside will be an ola, like Rav Huna Marav taught, the Amar Rav Huna Marav, well, he himself taught. Asham shanita kluraayo shachato stam kosher ola. So therefore you'll be liable if you slaughter it outside. Okay, so the rest of the brayse says, the rest of the daf is very different. So first we go through this part of the Mishnah, and that says that if you brought something outside that was not typically supposed to go on the altar, you're not going to be liable for avoda b'chutz. And the Mishnah gave examples of that. How do we even know if you brought any of the meat outside the courtyard as an offering? Or mimosa or omer or shtei lechem, or the leftover of the omer, or the 2 loaves of bread, v'lechem aponim, v'shir minachos. How do I know that in all these cases, and the leftover of the mincha offering, all these things are not supposed to go on the altar if they're in the base of mikdash shapater? I don't know if you brought it outside, you're not chayav. Tamomer olah. It has to be capable or supposed to be worthy to go up on the altar. And these things are not. Minayin she'afa yotzik v'aboel v'aposes v'amoeach v'amenif v'amegesh v'amesader ha'shulchan v'ametiv v'saneretz v'akometz v'amakal b'chut shepater. How do I know that if you pour the oil, or you mix the flour in the oil, or you crush the mincha, or you salted the mincha, or you waved it, or you were magish, that you waved it, or you brought it up to the mizbeach, or if you arrange the bread on the table, or if you cleared out the candles, or you did the kmitza, or you received the blood outside, all these cases, how do I know that you're exempt? It has to be something that's the completion of this service and not a different stage of the service. So the yayin nesach would be something you'd be liable for, because that is the completion of the service. And the Gemara says as follows. Ad Shalahu Kama Mishkan. Now we go into the historical part of the Mishkan. The historical part of the Mishkan, of the Mishnah, which said that until the Mishkan was established, all the service in the temple was done by the firstborn. And once the Mishkan was established, the service was done no longer by the firstborn, but by the Kohanim. Now we have a contradiction to that, because Yosef Rav Huna bar Rav Katina. We already had Rav Huna, we had Rav Huna Marav, and now we have Rav Huna bar Rav Katina. He said, Kamed Rav Chisda, Vikakari. He was sitting there and he was reading from the pasuk. Who was reading? Rav Huna or Rav Chisda? So it seems that from the different years, that it was Rav Chisda who was reading the pasuk, and he quotes the pasuk from the end of Parashas, I think Mishpatim, from the end of Mishpatim, it says, Vayishlach Asnarei b'nei Yisrael. And the children of Israel, it says that they sent forth and they brought olos. Rashi here says, what is going on here? Rashi says, Nira be'enai, it seems to me, says Rashi, Shasfarim chaserim kan. Our books are defective here. Below Yadati Ma, I don't know what it's missing. Vim ein chaserim, and if they wouldn't be missing, Zeo Pirisho. This is the explanation. That Rav Chisda was sitting there and he cited this verse and he said that this refers to the firstborns. In this verse that says that they brought olos is a reference to the fact that the firstborn of Bnei Israel brought carbon olos. So Vayishlach es na'arei Bnei Israel. So this proves that the firstborns brought the olos. So Amrei Hachi Amar Avasi Upasku, and then Rav Huna responded to Rav Chisda, after they brought it there at Sinai, they stopped, which means that they brought the karbanos, the Kohanim started bringing it from a year before the Mishkan was built, already from Har Sinai. That's when the Kohanim started doing the Avodah. So, Savar lo suve mimas nisin. So Rav Chisda thought to contradict Rav Huna from our Mishnah, which said that the Kohanim always started once the Mishkan was built. But Shamei the Kamar Mishmei Rav Adabar Ava, but then he heard that Rav Rav Chisda heard that Rav Huna cited a different teaching. Rav Adabar Ava said, Ola sheikrivu Yisrael b'amidbar, inatuna hefshe v'nituach. And he heard that the olos that they brought in the wilderness do not require the skinning and the dismembering, which generally speaking an ola requires. And he said, you know what? Osvei brisa deshavya bekulu. I'll bring a brisa that will contradict him about both points. A, that the Kohanim that the Kohanim took over not at Sinai, but at the Mishkan. And B, that they did the Hefshet v'nituach on the Olah even in the wilderness before the Mishkan was built. And I'll prove it to you. Tanya, we learned in the Brayta, Atzlo hukam ha-Mishkan, Abamos mutaros, the Bamos were allowed, Va'avoda bebechoros, and the Avoda was bebechoros, by the firstborn, until the Mishkan was built. So it contradicts what Rav Huna taught. And secondly, and everyone was able to bring behema, chaya, va'op, zecharim, and the kevos, tamim, and balamumin, tahor, and avot tamim. They could only bring kosher animals, not kosher. Va'kol karvu olos. The olah sheikriv Yisrael b'mimbar te'una hefshev v'nituach. And everybody brought an olah, and the olah required this dismembering and the skinning. The nachrim is manazeh rashayim la'asos kain. And nowadays, nachrim the non-Jews are able to do this. They are able to bring on bamos, even though for a Jew it's prohibited. So we see from here this double contradiction. One, it says until the Mishkan, it was the Bechor, not until Sinai. And number two, that you had to do the dismembering of the Olah, and not like Rav Huna said, that you didn't have to do that in the wilderness. So the Gemara says, well, Tanaihi. They each have their Tanaim. It's a Machukas Tanaim. Did the Bechor stop at Sinai, or did the Bechoros stop at the Mishkan? It's Machukas Tanaim whether it required dismembering of the Olah even before the Mishkan. It says in the pasuk about Sinai, also the Kohanim that come close to Hashem must be sanctified, must separate themselves. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Omer Zu Prishos beBechoros. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says this means the firstborns who were serving as the Kohanim had to separate before Sinai. Rabbi Omer Zu Prishos Nadav and Avio. So he says, no, this refers to Nadav and Avio, and therefore they had to separate. They were already the Kohanim, so they took over at that point. And those are the two opinions. But the Gemara says, well, once we establish this, Bishlam Hamar Zu Prishos Nadav and Avio. It makes sense according to what it says. This is separation of Nadav and Avihu. And that's why it states later on after Nadav and Avihu died. Where Moshe says to Aaron, this is what God said: "Bikrovai Kadesh." Those closest to me, I will become Kadesh, meaning to say, Hashem fulfilled that which He said in Matan Torah, that also Nadav and Avihu should separate. And now that they weren't careful, they were killed. But according to the one who says that this refers to Rabbi Yeshua, who says this refers to the precious of the Bechoros, where were Nadav and Avihu are told Bikrovaya Kadesh. So hey Charamiza, where's the hint? So he says, I'll tell you where it is. Because it says in the pasuk it says, I will make myself known to Bnei Israel, and it will become sanctified through my honor. Al tikri bichvodi, but says the Gemara, don't read through my honor of God. El b'mechubadai, I will become sanctified through those who are most honorable to me, and that's how the Aron was sanctified. That's how the Mishkan was sanctified, through the death of Nadav and Avihu, since they were the most close to Hashem. Davar Zamar Kodesh Baruch Hu Moshe. God said this to Moshe, V'lo Yadu. Moshe didn't know who it was. Rashi on the Torah says he thought it was referring to him and Aaron. Ad Shemesu B'nei Aaron. Once the B'nei children of Aaron died, Kimin Shemesu B'nei Aaron, Amrlo Aaron Achilo Mesu B'necha Al Lahakdish Shemo Shel Yisrael. The Shemo Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu. And he says the reason why they died was to sanctify the name of God. And Kimin Sheyada Aaron Shabanav Yiduim Malcolm Hain. Once Aaron knew that his children were Yiduim Malcolm, that they were honored in the eyes of God, they were known to God, and God said they will become holy to me. I will become honored through them, through the most honorable ones to me. Shasak v'kibel schar. He was quiet and he received reward for not challenging God, for his silence. And it says afterwards, Vayidom Aaron. Aaron was silent, and he received reward for his silence. David also, it says, Doma Hashem v'ischoel lo. Silence to Hashem v'ischoel lo. Afal pisha ma'pilcha chalam, even though thousands will die, you have to be quiet and receive the reward. And also by Shlomo it says, Hu Omer, Eislach Hashos ve'Eisel daber, a time for silence and a time to speak. Pa'amim shotzek mekabel schar al ashtiko, pa'amim medaber mekabel schar al adibor. Sometimes you have to be quiet and receive reward, and by not challenging God for the silence. And sometimes you have to speak and receive praise of God and receive reward for the speaking. What does it mean when it says, God will be made awesome from your mikdash? Don't read it from your sanctuaries, your synagogues, your temples. God will be made awesome from your holiest ones. When God makes judgment on those who are holiest to him, misyare umisalo, then the people are in awe of God and he's elevated in their eyes. So that explains why there was a machokas tanaim about whether or not the firstborn stopped at Sinai or at the building of the Mishkan. What about the fact that one opinion says that the Olah was dismembered in the wilderness? The other opinion says it wasn't. Elakashia Olah. We still have a question on Olah, about the Olah. Was it dismembered or not? So the Gemara says again, it's Trei Tanahi. Again, it's two Tanaim. The Tanya Rabbi Shmuel Omer Klos Nemer B'Sinai Upratos Be'ol Moed. Rabbi Shmuel's position is only the generalities were said at Sinai, and therefore the Olah was not dismembered at Sinai because it didn't give that specific law. But all the specific laws were repeated at the Olah Moed, when Moshe stood at the entrance to the tent. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, Klos Upratos Nemer B'Sinai V'Nishnu B'Ol Moed V'Nishtalshu B'Haravos. According to Rabbi Akiva, everything was said at Sinai, the generalities and the specifics, repeated at the Olah Moed and said a third time in the plains of Moab. But according to Rabbi Shmuel, the Olah we didn't know the halacha to dismember the Olah until it was said in Parashas Vayikra. So we see from here that the idea that the entire Torah was given at Sinai is a machlokas tanaim. Was the entire Torah given at Sinai, or was just the generalities given at Sinai? And then later on, in different stages in the wilderness, the specifics of the Torah were transmitted. But the idea that the entire Torah was given at Sinai is not a universally accepted position. Perhaps was given later. Okay, that is today's daf, and I guess the first part really we should go over again. We'll do that at 8:00.